going to come to the front. We've got about 35 minutes or so. It's interesting. This reminds me of a great article written by someone who's the chief economist of the of the World Bank, a guy called Paul Romer, who wrote an article back in, I think, September last year, called something like The Problem of Macroeconomics. And basically he describes macroeconomics as a cult. And actually it's sort of interesting, I think, the discussion that in a way that we're looking at the sort of maybe the creation of a cult. But let me open up to see who'd like to ask any questions about the sort of analysis or what we should do about it, or take the conversation any way we like. Can you give me your name?
Yeah, sure. I'm John. I'm a student of psychoanalysis. Thank you for your talk. I'm also trained in medicine and psychiatry, and unfortunately I would say there are many parallels in terms of getting your authorship, and particularly certain very up-and-coming fields such as genetics. Billions have been spent trying to find a gene for schizophrenia without success. But where those billions could have been spent in pro-social context kind of research, who knows what might have come out of that, for example. But my question was, how I know it's a difficult one, but looking at institutions and how they kind of reward and the motivation part of an institution, that relationship between the greater macro context, say, of having an agenda for economics that might, say, for example, improve equality in society. How might one analyze that relationship between institutions rewarding their professors and those larger macro leanings towards having fairer societies, for example?
I think the reward system, at least within academia, is pretty much independent of the extent to which any particular literature moves towards any particular goal. There's a few exceptions, in that sometimes there is good literature that makes an actual genuine discovery, and it does, receive a good amount of attention, and then the authors are properly rewarded. But that's more the exception than the rule. But that opportunity is there, for people who do want, there was a, pivotal article by Alan Kruger, who, asked, according to economic theory, in the United States, a big policy issue is the minimum wage and how large or small it should be. And the most standard, simple economic theory that's taught at the introductory microeconomic level is that the minimum wage can only be bad. It can only create this equilibrium and create a shortage of labor. And that's the most simplistic, view. And yet he did an empirical study where a minimum wage was raised, in one state of the United States while it wasn't in the other. And he tried to keep all the other controls of the experiment the same, essentially, and found that employment increased when the minimum wage was raised, and that, there's a lot of possible explanations for that kind of thing. But that got a lot of attention, and that might be sort of a indirect, promotion of more equality in our society by making that observation.
But can I just sort of ask you, as I take it, so how do, if disciplines are institutions or clubs of people, now a lot of such institutions have values, or like doctors have a Hippocratic oath or something like that. Could that help, Alan, do you think? Or could we sort of introduce, should academics swear to try and make the world a better place?
Well, so institutionally, and this gets back to your point about incentives, Stephen, about which we might disagree a little bit.
Sure.
in that tomorrow, Harvard and MIT, just the two of them, could band together and say, we are creating a new economic journal called The Public Good, and we are going to personally assign it maximum weighting in our own hiring processes. They would instantaneously make that a very desirable journal. And if the purpose there were to publish articles that contributed to the public good, we would arguably get quite a bit more scholarship on really relevant societal questions pretty much immediately. But I would just caution, and that could happen tomorrow, and actually advised in my thesis that the Canadian profession do that with the Canadian Journal of Economics, because they basically could decide to increase its ranking in deciding to increase its ranking, if that it makes any sense. So if a bunch of the top schools just decided to do that, to value it more, it would be valued more immediately, which is one of the strange things about economics and rankings. But so that institutions could very simply change what's valued. But the caution there is that anything that you establish as an end turns the things that you do to get to that end into means that are devalued by definition. So, and this actually applies to business school education. There have been some studies done that are very, very interesting that show that business school students are more likely to view their education as a means, which kind of makes sense. I mean, the goal is to make money via an MBA, for example. And they're more likely to devalue the actual content of what they're learning in the MBA as a result. And there are lots of correlations like that, at least. The more people value the end of their degree, the less that they're likely to value the degree in and of itself, the experience of it, the things that they learn, the peer interactions, that sort of thing. So I think anytime we put in place incentives or metrics, we have to keep in mind that that then becomes the goal that is valued in and of itself and turns some of the rest into means, which just means that we should do it very carefully and at least deconstruct some of the incentives that are negative right now that are skewing things terribly, such as this obsession with the top 5 journals in economics, which do publish on occasion pieces of drivel, like what we just saw.
Right. I think one aspect we have to be careful about, though, is that one of the selling points, one of the parts of the show business that go into getting literature published is not only the esoteric math, but the popular theme or cause that it's purporting to address. So you can find lots of articles in top-ranking economic journals that might have a title like, "How can we reduce poverty?" Okay, and then, on reading this, you say, well, there's, you start reading it and say, well, there's this one model of reduction of poverty, and it has this mathematical properties, and there's another one with this mathematical properties, and I propose a third one with this mathematical properties, and let's see what these mathematical properties do. And this article will absolutely provide no help at all to impoverished people. But one of the selling points is that the journal will people studying poverty will feel obligated to cite this journal because otherwise they will be accused of not doing an adequate literature review, and then the journal gets what it wants by getting its citations. I'm sorry.
So
No,
to every
true.
action, there's a reaction.
No, it's true, and in fact, there probably should be. Some political economy journals have now kind of taken up the mantle of the mathematized versions of what used to be totally standard economics. So explaining things in words instead of numbers. But that's no longer, those journals will not get you much credit in an economics department, and as they become more and more insular, that'll continue to kind of keep out any conceptual work that isn't just totally incomprehensible equations.
Can we we've got behind you, Paul. Sorry, your name's?
Yeah, Jamie. So first thing I was something Ellen said about the selection, of course, and the self-selection within that. I've certainly found that. I tried incredibly hard to find a pluralist masters for next year. I talked to Steve Keane, who was mentioned earlier, and it just doesn't exist to a reasonable quality. He teaches something that is quite heterodox at Kingston, but by his own admission, it's not the kind of standard he would like it. And the universe as a whole isn't really set up for it, even if the department is. So it basically doesn't exist. And I know friends that have been put off entirely, very capable, very intelligent, but are just not prepared to sit through more years of what we had over the last 3 years. So I think that's definitely true in terms of not even just putting off people, but also sort of changing people as they go through, I think is really important. But what I wanted to ask was, sort of, you talk about the historical side of things, which is really interesting, but I was wondering why that's happened rather than just sort of has, and why it's happened for economics but not for other disciplines, unless it has, but like why for economics?
Very good question. A lot of this came from the United States, as is true of there was a concerted intervention on the part of big money. There were a bunch of significantly endowed foundations that decided to, first of all, legitimize business school education, which used to be considered the bottom of the heap. So they wanted to kind of increase the intellectual legitimacy of the business school, and economics was a huge part of that. They needed economics to become kind of the chief academic discipline alongside related fields like finance and so on in business schools. And in doing so, they basically poured a whole lot more money into economics as well, and made them just very prestigious, but also market-oriented fields. So the more, and that has to do with, I mean, the whole zeitgeist as well changed around that time, because not only was there a huge influx of money, but also Milton Friedman's ideas, which had been kind of disregarded prior to the kind of 70s and then majorly in the 80s, started to take on a new legitimacy, and then yet more money was able to come in and kind of build that conception of economics, which really drove out everything else. So if you talk to most professors in economics who have any kind of pluralist leanings, they'll describe like the bloodbath of the 80s and the 90s for those that were slow in getting rid of heterodox economists and basically anyone who did not follow the kind of standardized procedure. It was concerted effort, and it worked.
Do you want to add to that, or what's?
No, I mean, I can't
Go
add
further.
much to it. I mean, there's some kind of misconception that for economic theory to be scientific and supported by science foundations, it's got to have no political implications, and otherwise, whatever is funding it will be accused of being political. And so there's this sort of safety net in the neutrality of just having math for math's sake, because then you are saying, you're pretending to be theoretical physics when the properties of economics and theoretical physics are very, very different. But there's that pretension that you're, discovering. And I mean, there are important economic theories that are important in their own right that don't have any political implications, but I'm just saying that it's easier to build on them with, less useful theories than to create theories that do have political implications, because then you're subject to criticism that, that whoever funded you has a bias or something.
All right, Paul.
I've been having some trouble about professional integrity and hard guns. It spreads in this country too, in particular in the area of chartered accountants, who find themselves favouring the company that pays the fees and not really having any regard for the public interest. And another one would be the chartered surveyor, who fiddles the viability assessment in order to make the biggest profit for the landowner, and to build the fewest possible affordable homes for the public again. And the one that really worries me is the nudge unit at the Cabinet Office, which is a so-called independent company, which the Cabinet Office has a quarter share in. And it can't be anything else other than you're an example of your hard gun. I mean, it is there to reduce the number of of regulations in the interests of the government's theories, rather than to provide any sensible scientific view of behavioral economics. But they all say it's very, very good. Behavioral economics is very scientific, and we're just doing a very good job for the public, but they're not, I think.
So how widespread is the sort of hired gun phenomenon in economics? Do you
It's very widespread. How many people have seen, by the way, the documentary Inside Job? Yeah, would people who have seen it agree that it was at least widespread at the time? That it's a very revealing documentary. You know, it's much more prevalent than it appears to be. But I mean, what can I say? It's one of the biggest problems is, often comes out is who does the peer review of these things, because what happens is you have, technical experts on a very, very specific, field of area of study, and then there might be only 20 or 30 experts who are considered potential peer reviewers of those experts. And if you look into the history, they've all co-authored each other's papers and known each other in graduate school and drinking buddies and whatever you can imagine. It's very much a club in many cases, and when they have to peer review their cronies, they give favorable peer reviews, and this is what sort of maintains the cronyistic existence of these groups. So one of the solutions would be for peer review to be much broader, where people, even from other fields, who know enough about economics to understand the work, but are not considered in the club, and see what they have to say about this work. So, I mean, that's, a partial solution, I think, that has to be carried out.
Did your interviews cover this sort of issue of hired guns?
Oddly enough, my day job does more so. One thing that we should use as a metric here is, there's this famous quotation at this, this pier in which there are these beautiful yachts and so on, and they were all owned by asset managers. And someone asked, where are the customers' yachts? And the conclusion there, and there have been a whole bunch of interesting papers around kind of the rent-seeking of the finance industry. If you look at a country like the Netherlands, they get a way better pension deal than you do here in the UK. And the extra money is going towards fees to asset managers. Don't tell my boss I said that. But that's...
Are we still being
It's all being recorded.
I'm joking. They don't know that. But no, it's this idea that pension for the public, for the beneficiaries, would include as low fees, as low as possible, and that a system like that should be governed by large bodies that have that public interest in mind. Whereas if you have a chopped up system in which each player is trying to negotiate with a very powerful financial institution, you're not going to get as good a deal, and you don't, empirically.
Gary, and then I'm going to, with every single question, actually I was told, I went to another event recently, actually it was the Nudge Unit, where Gus O'Donnell said the one rule that evidence shows is you have to have the first question for a woman and then all the other questions are much better. And we've had not a single question will come up from a woman yet, so obviously that's the reason we're getting nowhere. So I'm going to encourage diversity on that front if we can. Gary.
Yes, you've spoken a lot about this literature-only type of research and analysis, and I agree entirely with what you're saying, and I imagine that a vast amount of intellectual energy and human potentiality is completely wasted and effectively poured all these great brains, and they're pouring results of their work down the drain effectively because it's no use. Okay, that's I don't know, half of economics activity. But what about economic theory that does relate to the real world, but that is either wrong or misguided or inadequate? And I am thinking here in particular of the kind of stuff you read in standard textbooks, which to me seems to be wrong and misguided because it's based on, I believe it's based on the idea of equilibrium. But the world that we know, the business, the commercial world, the world of politics and economy, it's one thing it's not is an equilibrium. It moves and shifts all the time like the surface of the ocean. How can you possibly have an academic profession that's founded on this concept of equilibrium and everything tends to an equilibrium when that's, to me anyway, that seems a false initial starting point. And therefore you ought to scrap 90% of it and start again.
So you're giving an easy ride to cover your literature only on the stuff that actually is more dangerous.
Well, I agree that there's much too much emphasis on equilibrium. I think there's something to be said for equilibrium because it does explain a lot of the way economics works, but I think the key question is not what happens at equilibrium, but sort of how close you are to equilibrium. And whether if you're not close to equilibrium, then what else happens? So it's like a lot of what I did my dissertation on is the economics of technological change. And I looked at, changes in products and services, how they evolve all the time. So if you look at, is there an equilibrium in the market for cell phones? Well, how can there be? Every time you turn around, there's a new model. There's no absolute equilibrium. There's only sort of a fuzzy area that's kind of like an equilibrium. And the question is how, what influence that fuzzy area has and how that area is moving, and this and that. So there's a lot of disequilibria, and I think that's part of that relates to what I'm saying because, disequilibrium really, causes problems for people who want to make these models more and more sophisticated and add more equations to them and do more, advanced, finding, final solutions to the structural models that they start with. If they don't have equilibrium, then that's a tool that kind of like it doesn't get them to their final equations. So I agree that this is kind of interrelated, but I wouldn't go as far as I think personally the first couple years of economics, the introductory economics, and introductory micro and macro, I think the equilibrium in those classes are generally okay because they do explain, because you talk to people and they think, why is there price for something? And they say, well, there's a price for something because the seller says it's this price. Or there's a price for something because only consumers want to, buy it at that price. There is an equilibrium, that determines most prices, at least partially, even though that equilibrium may be fuzzy and moving and that kind of thing.
But can I challenge you on this because, if we are sort of positive about pluralism, there are a lot of other schools of economic thought that wouldn't go near the concept of equilibrium and would think it's meaningless. And so if you were going to have a pluralist economics course, you might say, well, in this way we use equilibrium and it can be useful or not useful or whatever, but if you look at it from a different perspective, we don't, there's nothing about equilibrium, there's about institutions or there's about complexity or there's about, everything. So isn't it, it's not the problem that equilibrium might be mentioned, but it's the only thing that's mentioned in the first 2 years of an economics course.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree that it, that all the other factors and the limitations of the equilibrium type models need to,
But it's not just the limitation. Other schools do not mention equilibrium as
all.
a concept because they wouldn't see it as a useful tool.
Well, personally, I think there's something to be said for equilibrium, at least as an important part of economic thought. So I wouldn't. I'm not of that school of thought myself, but that's
you
getting
allow
into
the other schools of thought to be taught.
Oh, definitely, they should be taught to balance it out.
But isn't that the problem that only one school of thought is taught?
Oh, I agree. That's a problem. Yes.
Plus, you
Is
could
it-
end up discussing equilibria all the time, which is arguably not as useful for the major issues of our era, you know, climate change and mass migration and so on and so forth, things that, tax havens, blah, blah, blah. You've got a whole bunch of issues that are not covered in the standard curriculum, and that don't have tools that students are learning that could be applied to those problems. And so probably, you know, that whole discussion of whether equilibria, the kind of equilibria framework is useful as opposed to this one or that one, could end up taking up too much time in a more modern curriculum that should include a much wider variety of topics than the narrow kind of, you know, where the supply demand reaches the demand.
Yeah, yeah.
Across this thing.
It's always like that.
The demand curve.
Now I'm going to positively discriminate in the
Okay.
third hand up.
Thank you. Well,
What's your name, sorry?
Bernarda. You were speaking about standardization in economics, and I think it is more in the teaching and in the curricula than in the literature in publication, because now economics, for being very mathematical and getting better publications, for example, they are publishing with biologists. They are trying to publish to target also nature, not only American Economic Review, but I have seen also in American Economic Review papers mixing evolutionary theory with investment theory to explain the brain size. And yes, it is trying to justify that economics is a hard science, and for example, they like to be closer to biologists, evolutionary theory and game theory than to sociologists, for example, because I don't know if it's for a feeling of being more scientists or to get better publications.
So you think there's a move towards natural science within the top economic journals,
Yeah.
and
For
they
example,
feel more comfortable drawing on natural science than other social sciences.
Yeah, they are. For example, there is an economist, Ted Beckstrom, I think. He has a son who is a biologist, and they publish together. And in American Economic Review, I have seen papers, including the Nobel Prize Heckman, is now explaining a lot on cognitive development for early infancy, and yes, it's more close to the biology and to the natural science than to the sociology or law.
And is that a good or a bad thing, do you think?
I don't know what is the motivation, but I think it's missing the more social implications, because the target is a kind of intellectual target. For example, I remember the paper I saw on American Economic Review on explaining the brain size. I don't know, but it was not economic implications. It was just, I think, investment theory mixed with evolutionary theory, biology. No, and it was published in American Economic Review.
So do you think the big missing thing is the social dimension?
I think I haven't had the impression that there's some kind of a new embracing of biology or some other fields, within economics. But again, I don't want to sound like a broken record or boring with the constant theme, but there's a lot of show business in the whole thing. And I think the bottom line is if an article is coming out and it says, hey, we're honoring biology in this article, we're merging with biology. To me, the ultimate question is it truly valuable knowledge? Is it explaining causality? Is it something that biologists and economists or other people reading it can say, this really is helping us understand the world better, helping us make better policies based on a better understanding? Or is it just a model that we just borrowed some additional components of another literature, it's sort of like, are we really like 42nd Street, and we're really tap dancing the whole time, but we hired some acrobats to look like Cirque du Soleil in our theater. You know, are we really trying to advance true knowledge and causal understanding of the phenomenon we're studying, or are we, you know, developing, you know, these bodies of ideas that we can get published? I'm sorry I'm sounding like a broken record, but I think that's the bottom
So is
line.
it just a new game?
Right, it's
but with no relevance to the outer world, or is it actually a serious attempt to understand the world?
Well, and,
right.
and it feeds directly into the hierarchy of the academic world in the eyes of economists as a group, but not meant to malign them all with the same brush. I mean, the funding that changed the structure of business schools and economics departments over time, part of the intellectual exercise was how to legitimize a traditionally delegitimized field of study. And the way that they did that was to link it to the hard sciences and mathematics as much as possible. So I'm really unsurprised to see that they're not running towards the sociologists, they're running towards a chance to publish in Nature, because that is the epitome of academic hierarchy, which is ultimately what is pushed for within economics departments, even if the individual economics professors wouldn't want that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. I hope I didn't interrupt. In my book, I have a section in one of the chapters where I talk about the National Science Foundation and how it heavily promoted experimental economics. In fact, experimental economics in the United States wouldn't be anything like it is without an enormous impetus in the 1980s and 1990s by the National Science Foundation to support experimental economics. And the reason was because the National Science Foundation was under heavy political pressure to possibly remove its economics granting program. And the accusation that it was facing was that economics is too unlike science, and therefore the business of the National Science Foundation, being to promote basic science, should not be funding something so unlike science. And in an effort to fend off that criticism, the National Science Foundation made a deliberate effort to promote a real lot of studies done in experimental economics.
And was that a good thing? Did experimental economics help in terms of our understanding of the real world at all?
Overall, I would overall in the book I'm critical of experimental economics. There's some experimental economics that's good. I give examples of experimental economics at its worst. Where basically, you could be doing an just as a quick little story. Okay, I was in the Department of Agriculture one time as an economist. I was studying the economics of food safety in terms of what people were willing to pay for safer food. And there was a group of people, which is questionable in itself, okay, but that's a whole ethical issue in itself. But anyway, there was a study done, okay, where somebody was combining experimental economics with auction theory and studies of food safety, which was funded so that because food safety became an issue because of some food safety disasters that happened shortly before that. Anyway, so this one study had students who were in an experimental economics setting who were pretending.
That's in a laboratory with lots of computers.
Right, no, just in a classroom where they have a computer in front of them where they're pretending to bid on things. And one group of students were told that they were going to eat a sandwich, that they could buy a sandwich, but they had to bid on the guarantee that it was a safe sandwich and didn't have a 1 in 1,000 chance of having salmonella poisoning. And then another group was given the same experiment, but with a 1 in 100 chance. and they were playing around with auctions and generating enormous data that could be processed through a very elaborate econometric model to generate results to get a publication out. And the group that had a 1 in 100 chance of getting a salmonella poisoned sandwich actually bid less on the 100% safer sandwich than the 1 in 1,000% chance group. And I at that time when I was hearing the presentation, I asked the economists running this stuff, well, why is that people actually pay less for a 1 in 100 chance, safety than 1 in 1,000? And then they said, well, we had a bunch of students and they were in a room, and in that particular room, that particular group, they kind of got carried away with it, and so this other group didn't do that. And that's what it was. But the whole idea was that all this data, and the article was published in the American Economic Review. Their findings were published in that, because it was an examination of the econometric properties of their auctioning process. But basically, you've generated data from just students playing around in a hypothetical situation who of course, they knew that they were not going to be poisoned. So a lot of experimental economics was like this, but it looks good. It's experimental economics, so it looks like a science, and it was on a very important issue, food safety. So why, so there you go.
We're actually past our end point, and actually I thought that was quite a good point to end in a way. That you can end up with stuff that has this sort of outward appearance of being like science, but then you sort of scratch away the surface just a little bit, and it's just another game to achieve another publication that ticks another box. Which is, well, it's also maybe a depressing end, but I think we had a very good discussion, and of course now you're invited along to share a glass of wine, and of course you can approach Stephen and Ellen to get them to further elaborate or discuss further what they've been talking about. So I'd just like you to thank them very much for giving us a very stimulating discussion this evening.